Apart from the trigrams and taiji, what are some common traditional symbols?
Ancient lore associates fundamental features of Chinese cosmology with specific symbols. It all goes back to the Chinese atom, Pangu. In his task of imposing order on primal chaos, Pangu enlisted the help of 5 cosmic assistants: Azure Dragon, White Tiger, Phoenix, Tortoise, and Unicorn. Pangu assigned to each of the first 4 a quarter of the universe. Azure Dragon governed the East, associated with spring, new life, benevolence, and protection. White Tiger ruled the autumnal West, symbol of maturity and a life well spent. All made possible by good government and courage. Phoenix, the ultimate solar bird, presided over the summery south with the kindly warmth and joy that arises in a world at peace. Hard-shelled and indomitable, the ageless tortoise faced the unforgiving, wintry north. Wandering freely among them all, the rare and delicate unicorn was commissioned to appear wherever and whenever benevolence and justice reigned on earth. It is not surprising that all 5 of these wondrous beings retain their appeal to the popular imagination and remain essentials of the religious symbolic repertoire. A cluster of items associated loosely with Daoism are called the 8 Daoist emblems. Each represents one of the 8 immortals, a group of human beings who became immortal in various ways. They appear often as decorative motifs on all kinds of objects. The emblems are a fan, a sword, a gourd, castanets, a flower basket, a bamboo drum, a flute, and a lotus flower. This is one of several sets of 8 motifs popular in Chinese art and, along with the 8 Buddhist emblems, one that still carries specifically religious resonances.
Apart from the trigrams and taiji, what are some common traditional symbols?
Ancient lore associates fundamental features of Chinese cosmology with specific symbols. It all goes back to the Chinese atom, Pangu. In his task of imposing order on primal chaos, Pangu enlisted the help of 5 cosmic assistants: Azure Dragon, White Tiger, Phoenix, Tortoise, and Unicorn. Pangu assigned to each of the first 4 a quarter of the universe. Azure Dragon governed the East, associated with spring, new life, benevolence, and protection. White Tiger ruled the autumnal West, symbol of maturity and a life well spent. All made possible by good government and courage. Phoenix, the ultimate solar bird, presided over the summery south with the kindly warmth and joy that arises in a world at peace. Hard-shelled and indomitable, the ageless tortoise faced the unforgiving, wintry north. Wandering freely among them all, the rare and delicate unicorn was commissioned to appear wherever and whenever benevolence and justice reigned on earth. It is not surprising that all 5 of these wondrous beings retain their appeal to the popular imagination and remain essentials of the religious symbolic repertoire. A cluster of items associated loosely with Daoism are called the 8 Daoist emblems. Each represents one of the 8 immortals, a group of human beings who became immortal in various ways. They appear often as decorative motifs on all kinds of objects. The emblems are a fan, a sword, a gourd, castanets, a flower basket, a bamboo drum, a flute, and a lotus flower. This is one of several sets of 8 motifs popular in Chinese art and, along with the 8 Buddhist emblems, one that still carries specifically religious resonances.
Are number, color, or nature symbolism important in Daoist tradition and CCT?
Astrological calculation and cosmological imagery have long been an integral part of Chinese religious views. Hundreds of symbolic elements make up this vast system of correspondences. Zodiacal animals are associated with the 12 months. Each of the 4 quadrants of the universe has its 7 constellations in addition to its connection with specific trigrams, all related to particular aspects of good fortune or difficulty. Each of these elements is further coordinated with one of the 5 symbolic colors: black, white, red, green, yellow, and elements: wood, water, earth, metal, fire, and organs of the human body. Here are some examples of popular animal symbolism. The crow, surprisingly perhaps, symbolizes the sun. The crane, guide of the immortals, means long life, as do the dove and the hare. Fish are reminders of renewal of life and abundance. By association with plowing new fields, the ox means spring and vitality. The sharp-eyed, quick-tongued parrot looks after faithfulness in marriage. Flowers, trees, and fruits almost always have some symbolic resonance. The springtime peony means tenderness and womanly beauty, as does the jasmine. The plum means winter and reminds of Lao Zi, who was born beneath a plum tree. Bamboo betokens endurance, the orange benevolence. A complete listing would fill several books. Of course, not everyone thinks consciously of specific symbolic meanings upon seeing any of the hundreds of visual decorative motifs in the full catalogue. But most Chinese still grow up surrounded by countless symbolic associations of this kind.
Are number, color, or nature symbolism important in Daoist tradition and CCT?
Astrological calculation and cosmological imagery have long been an integral part of Chinese religious views. Hundreds of symbolic elements make up this vast system of correspondences. Zodiacal animals are associated with the 12 months. Each of the 4 quadrants of the universe has its 7 constellations in addition to its connection with specific trigrams, all related to particular aspects of good fortune or difficulty. Each of these elements is further coordinated with one of the 5 symbolic colors, black, white, red, green, yellow, and elements, wood, water, earth, metal, fire, and organs of the human body. Here are some examples of popular animal symbolism. The crow, surprisingly perhaps, symbolizes the sun. The crane, guide of the immortals, means long life, as do the dove and the hare. Fish are reminders of renewal of life and abundance. By association with plowing new fields, the ox means spring and vitality. The sharp-eyed quick-tongued parrot looks after faithfulness in marriage. Flowers, trees, and fruits almost always have some symbolic resonance. The springtime peony means tenderness and womanly beauty, as does the jasmine. The plum means winter and reminds of Lao Zi, who was born beneath a plum tree. Bamboo betokens endurance, the orange benevolence. A complete listing would fill several books. Of course, not everyone thinks consciously of specific symbolic meanings upon seeing any of the hundreds of visual decorative motifs in the full catalogue. But most Chinese still grow up surrounded by countless symbolic associations of this kind.
Who was Lao Zi?
Lao Zi was likely an altogether legendary figure whose name simply means old teacher or master. Tradition says he was born around 604 BCE, making him a much older contemporary of Confucius. Kongfu Zi, 551 to 479 BCE, who was in turn an almost exact contemporary of the Buddha. The legend says Lao Zi was a clerk in the archives of the Zhou dynasty who practiced the way and its power and emphasized self-effacement and anonymity. When he became convinced that social disintegration and political corruption in the Zhou dynasty were irreversible, he decided to withdraw from society. Riding his water buffalo, the old man came to the frontier. There a customs officer besought him to write down his lofty teachings before departing. Lao Zi wrote the Dao De Jing, the classic of the way and its power, and disappeared, leaving a legacy of mystery. Much later stories, perhaps from a time when Daoists and Confucians were in competition for followers, tell of a meeting between Lao Zi and a youthful Confucius. No use wasting so much time studying your history, Lao Zi counseled the newcomer. Observe nature and you will see that love for the Dao is all that one needs. Popular tradition tends to identify Lao Zi as the one who first taught that ordinary folk could seek and attain immortality. Some scholars suggest that Lao Zi's legendary stature may have been enhanced as a result of his mistaken identification with the legendary Huangdi, known as the Yellow Emperor who ruled in the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE. Lao Zi was officially declared a god around 666 CE.
Our number, color, or nature symbolism important in Daoist tradition and CCT.
Astrological calculation and cosmological imagery have long been an integral part of Chinese religious views. Hundreds of symbolic elements make up this vast system of correspondences. Zodiacal animals are associated with the 12 months. Each of the 4 quadrants of the universe has its 7 constellations in addition to its connection with specific trigrams, all related to particular aspects of good fortune or difficulty. Each of these elements is further coordinated with one of the 5 symbolic colors: black, white, red, green, yellow, and elements: wood, water, earth, metal, fire, and organs of the human body. Here are some examples of popular animal symbolism. The crow, surprisingly perhaps, symbolizes the sun. The crane, guide of the immortals, means long life, as do the dove and the hare. Fish are reminders of renewal of life and abundance. By association with plowing new fields, the ox means spring and vitality. The sharp-eyed, quick-tongued parrot looks after faithfulness in marriage. Flowers, trees, and fruits almost always have some symbolic resonance. The springtime peony means tenderness and womanly beauty, as does the jasmine. The plum means winter and reminds of Lao Zi, who was born beneath a plum tree. Bamboo betokens endurance, the orange benevolence. A complete listing would fill several books. Of course, not everyone thinks consciously of specific symbolic meanings upon seeing any of the hundreds of visual decorative motifs in the full catalogue. But most Chinese still grow up surrounded by countless symbolic associations of this kind.
What is a monk and how are Buddhist monasteries organized?
In its wider sense, monk refers to any male Buddhist who enters a monastic institution. Whether permanently or for a short time, receiving at least the lower ordination to the status of novice, Shramanera. Strictly speaking, a monk is a male at least 20 years old who has been in the monastery at least 5 years and received the higher ordination to the status of bhikshu, mendicant. Monasteries are generally independent and autonomous foundations. Rather like Benedictine monasteries in Roman Catholicism, a very loose analogy. Buddhist monasteries of the same lineage or order are administered separately. Each monastery's internal structure combines offices, positions assigned by a monastic council or other governing body, and ranks distinctions often based on seniority or spiritual acumen. Offices in a Japanese Zen monastery include, for example, chief abbot. In a complex with many sub-monasteries and temples, abbot, kancho, Zen master, Rashi, meditation leader and disciplinarian. Jikijutsu, in the Zendo or meditation hall, administrator of the Zendo, Jisha, and head cook. An important rank is that of head monk, Jushoku, who might also hold the office of abbot in a sub-temple. Similarly, in Thai Theravada monasteries offices include abbots and meditation masters, and recognize various ranks, such as those of elder, thera, 10 years seniority, and great elder, mahathera, with 20 years seniority.
In brief, what is the history of religious Daoism?
Religious Daoism emerged as a recognizable tradition in its own right during the latter decades of the Han Dynasty, 202 BCE to 21 CE. Confucianism enjoyed imperial favor as the official creed of the state. But when the Han Dynasty disintegrated, both Daoism and Buddhism found room to grow. The early Celestial Masters school dominated the Daoist scene for the most part. Various schools teaching forms of alchemical Daoism developed early on and have continued throughout the past 2,000 years. In addition, new revelations claimed by various teachers gave rise to several new schools between the 3rd and 6th centuries, times of political fragmentation. See below for discussion of individual schools and denominations. With political reunification during the Sui, 581 to 618, dynasty, Daoism's various schools managed to survive in spite of meager imperial support. Many monasteries flourished but remained apart from the general populace. Things improved under the Tang dynasty, 618 to 906, when Daoists once again had friends in high places. Under the Song dynasty, 960-1279, Neo-Confucianism proved a powerful rival for Daoists at court. But Daoists fared well anyway, since many Neo-Confucians gladly exchanged ideas with Daoism's leading lights. During the Southern Song dynasty, 1127 to 1279. In spite of an almost complete lack of public imperial patronage, several new Daoist schools sprang up. Things took a turn for the worse under the Yuan dynasty, 1260 to 1368. Daoists invited to participate in court debates suffered serious setbacks, and paid dearly with the loss of monasteries and precious libraries. During the late medieval Ming dynasty, 1368 to 1644, Daoist fortunes improved again dramatically and many Daoist masters enjoyed prominent official positions. But under the last of the imperial regimes, the Qing, or Manchu, dynasty, 1644 to 1911, the pendulum swung the other way and religious Daoism struggled to survive the early modern period. Through the periods of the First Chinese Republic, 1912 to 1949, and the People's Republic, 1949 to present, Daoism has held on largely thanks to the establishment of several organizations designed to provide a public presence for the various orders and schools. After disastrous losses as a result of the Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 76, Daoist religious groups are again struggling to pull themselves back together.
What are some clues to understanding deist and CCT images?
By far the majority of deist and CCT images of sacred figures are portrayed with identifiably human bodies. They rarely have multiple heads or limbs, but they do have various special features. Deities are more often than not somber, sometimes of downright forbidding countenance, and typically depicted in such a way that the viewer is not likely to think of them as ordinary human beings. Bright red or yellow skin, flaring nostrils, riveted gaze, and the occasional menacing gesture discourage a too casual approach. Exceptions are some of the CCT deities who appear as gently smiling family members. Kindly aunts or grandparents, for example. But even they often have unusual skin tones, suggesting that these are not mere mortals. Some deities are recognizable, at least by association, because of the groupings in which they appear. Most important in this respect is the triad formation, generally depicting a main central figure flanked by two slightly smaller figures. Depending on the temple, these may depict any of several of the triadic variations mentioned above. Many temples install subordinate deities and semi-divine powers on side altars or in small rooms of their own along the inner perimeter of the main courtyard. Each deity has his or her distinguishing characteristics, but one generally finds fewer clear iconographic clues here than in Hindu or Buddhist art. For example, several deities may sport the same skin tones and facial expression and even carry very similar symbols. It is therefore sometimes impossible to discern individual identities of the characters without knowing in advance to whom a given temple is dedicated.
Has Daoism ever been identified with any political regimes?
During several periods of Chinese history, Daoism has enjoyed the considerable benefits of imperial patronage. One Daoist emperor in particular, during the mid-9th century, launched a devastating persecution of Buddhism that did serious damage to many of that tradition's institutions. There is a certain irony in that, given the classical Daoist teaching about law and government. According to the Dao De Jing and Zhuangzi, the best hope for society is unobtrusive leadership that does not need to rely on law and force to lead. Governmental institutions are meddlesome and oppressive. According to early Daoist authorities, the ideal social setting is the small village in which no one carries weapons. Very unlike classical Confucian tradition in this respect. The ideal Daoist society does away with social stratification of all kinds. Where all are equal, ruling and military classes are unnecessary. Throughout Chinese history, however, Daoists and Confucians have competed with one another for imperial support and patronage. Confucianism generally has been far more closely identified with government than has Daoism. Despite classical Daoist aversion to formal structures of government, Both the official and popular pantheons have retained a good deal of the imagery of imperial bureaucracy, as in the names of such deities as the Jade Emperor.
What is Neo-Daoism?
Neo-Daoism is a name commonly given to various developments around the 3rd and 4th centuries CE. Some scholars suggest that there were two recognizable schools. One was called secret mystical teaching, Xian Shui. According to some interpreters, an important theme was its emphasis on the quest for physical immortality. Earlier Daoist sources had spoken of immortality, but generally of the spiritual rather than the bodily sort. Neo-Daoism recommended exercises in breathing, diet, use of potions, elixirs, and talismans, and sexual activity reminiscent of Hindu and Buddhist tantric practices. But perhaps more fundamental in this alchemy were intense meditative practices intended to reveal the Dao within the individual. Some scholars interpret Xian Shui as developing out of Confucian rather than Daoist thought. A major feature of the second school, known as pure conversation, Qingtian, is its attempts to blend aspects of Daoist, Confucian, and Buddhist thought. Among its proponents were the so-called 7 sages of the bamboo grove, whose penchant for detached philosophical discourse and the cultivation of a Daoist aesthetic were among their hallmarks. On the basis of their reading of the Zhuangzi and Dao De Jing, they developed a neo-Daoist interpretation of the so-called Confucian classics. After the 5th century, Buddhist concepts infiltrated the movement to such a degree that Neo-Daoism gradually lost its distinctiveness and identity.
Are there religious hierarchical structures in any branch of Buddhism?
Early Buddhist teaching replaced the caste system's dramatic social and religious stratification with an egalitarian ideal. Be a lamp unto your own feet, the Buddha counseled his followers. His rejection of a mediating priesthood made the Buddha a sort of Protestant reformer. He wanted the life of the Sangha to represent a perfectly level playing field. In practice, the elevation of the monastic life over that of the laity introduced a kind of stratification into Buddhist life. Within the early monastic community, seniority alone distinguished one member from another. As the Sangha expanded and the itinerant mendicants began to settle into fixed residences, monastic life became more complex and required a division of labor. Though many decisions were taken by a monastic council, a de facto hierarchy developed. At the top was the abbot, assisted by spiritual guides and preceptors chosen from among the senior monks. The majority of the community was made up of senior monks and nuns and novices. In addition, many of the denominations eventually took on a semblance of hierarchical organization. but there is a major difference between the function of such organizational structures in Buddhist institutions and parallels in traditions like Roman Catholicism and Shiite Islam. Buddhist hierarchies seem to evolve as a result of internal structural needs rather than as a result of doctrine. Traditions that teach the need for mediators between ordinary people and the ultimate sources of truth and spiritual power develop hierarchical structures for theoretical as well as practical reasons.
Did Daoist tradition spread beyond China?
Daoism has exerted some influence at various times all over East and Southeast Asia. Wherever Chinese have traveled, Daoism has gone and left its mark. But it rarely has made its presence felt dramatically outside of China and territories under Chinese control. Daoist teachings, however, have had a significant impact on Chinese Buddhism over the centuries. Buddhism in turn has transported those usually well hidden contributions on its missionary road throughout Asia. In relatively recent times, Daoism, and teachings that claim to be Daoist, have begun to enjoy increasing popularity in Europe and the Americas, but on a much smaller scale than other traditions of Asian origin.
What do Daoists believe about ultimate spiritual reality or God?
Daoists call the ultimate spiritual reality Dao, the way. Long before the formal beginnings of Daoism's various movements and school, Chinese tradition used the term Dao as a general ethical notion implying the appropriate and moral way of acting. As so often happens when a religious tradition enters a new cultural setting, Buddhism's arrival in China led some thinkers to talk of a Buddhist way in contrast with which they began to define an indigenous Chinese way in the sense of religious beliefs and values. Daoist philosophers emphasized the unfathomable mystery of the Dao, but they viewed it as non-personal power rather than a personal divine entity. The religious equivalent seems to have been a deity called the Supreme Oneness, Tai Yi. The Dao De Jing's description of how the transcendent Dao became manifest suggests a type of emanation. Dao gave rise to the One, which produced the Two, and so on. That grand and uplifting description of the ultimate mystery still remained a bit too abstract for most people. As a result, when the first schools of religious Daoism began to formulate their beliefs, they naturally gravitated toward more concrete imagery. That included the deification of the individual, long believed to represent the way as an accessible teaching, namely Lao Zi. The process also led to personification of certain essential features of the mysterious Dao in the form of the heavenly triad called the Three Pure Ones. Developments of this sort multiplied, and the deities took on life stories and personalities that invited devotional interaction. In practice, the many personifications of divinity are arrayed according to an administrative structure parallel to that of the imperial bureaucracy. Religiously speaking, of course, the reality is just the other way round. The imperial institutions imitated the heavenly order of things.
What are trigrams and hexagrams?
Trigrams are sets of 3 vertically stacked horizontal lines made up of every possible combination of broken and solid line. Solid lines stand for the solar male yang, hot, bright, active, and dry. Broken lines stand for the earthy and lunar female yin, which is dark, moist, mysterious, and associated with valleys. Combinations of yin and yang in varying proportions give rise to the 8 essential elements in creation. Traditional presentations usually arrange the 8 trigrams as an octagon, at whose center stands the Taiji symbol for perfect yin-yang harmony. Each trigram is arrayed so as to face its opposite in the set. So for example, if you held a compass before you with north pointing up, heaven's 3 solid lines would stand across from Earth's 3 broken lines at what would be north and south. At due east stands water, with a solid line between a pair of broken lines, across from fire, with its broken line sandwiched between solids in the west. At northwest, lake's broken solid, reading from top to bottom, stands across from mountain's solid broken. And in the northeast, wind's solid broken balances off thunder's broken solid. Take the 8 trigrams and arrange them in all possible permutations by stacking one trigram atop another, and you get 64 hexagrams. Pile heaven upon heaven and the result is called the creative principle. Add earth to earth and you get the passive principle. Earth over heaven yields peace, while heaven over earth means stagnation. The single most important source for interpreting these arcane indicators is the I Ching, the classic of change. Tossing and rearranging a set of 50 sticks and then reading them as hexagrams with the help of that text remains a widely popular form of divination.
What signs or symbols might identify someone as a deist or practitioner of CCT?
Symbols associated with religious beliefs and folk practices abound in societies heavily influenced by Chinese culture. Over the centuries, the major Chinese religious traditions Taoist, Confucian, Buddhist, and popular have shared many of those symbols and signs. Overlapping of symbols of various traditions makes it difficult, if not impossible, to know at a glance to which tradition the owner and user of the symbols belongs. Signs and symbols generally associated with CCT include a vast range of protective and magical devices, amulets, and talismans. Perhaps the most widely used symbol is that of the perfect harmony of yin and yang, appearing on all sorts of personal items such as rings and pendants. The so-called Taiji, Supreme Ultimate, is a circle in which two equal but opposite curving tear shapes embrace. In other words, an S-curve line divides the circle in two equal parts. The darker half symbolizes yin, the brighter half yang, but the commingling of the two is symbolized by a dark dot in the larger end of the yang shape and a corresponding bright dot in the yin shape. Sometimes, as on the national flag of South Korea, that symbol is surrounded by the 8 trigrams, Bagwa. The trigrams are made up of combinations of solid yang lines and broken yin lines. Charm-like devices are extremely popular in Chinese societies. Textiles and other decorative items, like ceramic wares, invariably display a range of symbolic features. Symbols they show can include any of dozens of animal, plant, or inanimate objects associated with aspects of the greatest mysteries of life, of those things that human beings most hope for or fear. For example, the tortoise and crane mean long life, the dragon means protection, the phoenix warmth. The heron and countless other birds of good omen betoken happiness. While creatures of ill omen, such as the owl, portend death and bad fortune.
What other early sacred texts are especially important for deists?
A text known as the Zhuangzi, named after the man whose disciples may have authored it, dates from about the 4th century BCE. The work is also known as the Divine Classic of Nanhua. The town to which Zhuangzi was believed to have retired. Zhuangzi, the deist philosopher, c. 389–286 BCE, remains a relatively little-known figure. But the work that bears his name stands out as a foundational document in philosophical Daoism, whose interpretation of basic concepts also influenced many religious deists. In addition to its bold attacks on the inadequacy of Confucian teaching, the Zhuangzi presents essentially the same worldview as the Dao De Jing, especially the importance of non-effort, wu wei, or unmotivated action and its political implications. Zhuangzi emphasizes the concepts of longevity and immortality that would later take on great significance for many religious deists. Perhaps more important is the concept of mental purification called fasting of the heart. Zhuangzi's teaching has become an important element in deist mysticism, speaking often of a kind of oneness with the Dao. A deist philosopher named Li Zi is likewise said to have penned a work that bears his name. That book, also known as the true classic of the expanding emptiness, however, was almost certainly of a later time, and Li Zi is probably a legendary figure, containing materials of many different literary types, especially narrative forms such as anecdotes and parables. The book was probably compiled around 300 CE. Its 8 chapters arrange their literarily disparate materials thematically, addressing such topics as fate and human freedom, problems in establishing ethical standards, and the challenge of following the Dao. Here for the first time we hear of the Isles of the Blessed, home of the immortals. Like the Zhuangzi, the later work speaks at length about the complete freedom experienced in becoming one with the Dao.
What are some of the main varieties of Buddhist religious officials or specialists?
Each of the many distinct denominations and their constituent religious institutions has its characteristic division of labor. One way to keep it all straight is to think in terms of the four functional categories of administration: instruction, pastoral care, and spiritual example. There is naturally some overlapping, but the four categories offer an idea of the kinds of responsibilities and duties Buddhists consider most important. Denominations, monastic institutions, and local temples all have administrative structures and offices. Buddhists use terms roughly equivalent to bishop, abbot, and chief priest or pastor in this regard. Teachers or preceptors are charged with instructing both monastic and lay Buddhists, especially in the meditative disciplines. At the local level, priests and monks who serve the public in monastery, temples and chapels fulfill the pastoral care function, offering such services as counseling and visiting the sick, as well as leadership in worship. A final category that is in many ways distinctively Buddhist, and yet difficult to define, is that of spiritual exemplar. Here are located all the various ranks of revered patriarchs, founders, incarnations of previous holy persons, and individuals celebrated for teaching by example. Tibetan Buddhists, for example, call such people by various titles including Lama, Rinpoche, and Tulku.
How do monasteries function in Buddhist life?
During the early centuries of Buddhism, monks and nuns lived as itinerant beggars with no fixed abode. The practice of staying put during the monsoon season gave rise to permanent monastic institutions. Monks and nuns lived either in viharas, separate structures, or dwellings carved like caves into hillsides, guhas. Many early monasteries functioned somewhat like parishes, offering spiritual services to the local population. These smaller, more pastorally oriented monasteries were eventually replaced by larger monastic complexes with a focus on learning. Many monasteries, especially in Theravada lands, still offer educational services to the people of the area. In general, Theravada monasteries throughout Southeast Asia maintain somewhat more active links with the outside community than do Mahayana monasteries. Japanese Zen monasteries, for example, still focus on a life of seclusion and solitude. Tibetan institutions have until recently been the virtual backbone of community life on the roof of the world and were home to an extraordinarily large percentage of the male population. Some monasteries are now part of what one might call consortiums, with as many as 24 individual temple monasteries of the same denomination clustered within one larger institution. Most classic monasteries are walled enclosures divided into private and public areas. Monks' residences and private ritual spaces are separated from the ritual and educational facilities that serve visitors.
What is the main source of information on Lao Zi's life?
The main source of information on Lao Zi's life is a biography written by the historian Si Ma Chen, 145–86 CE, in his records of the historian. By this time a number of beliefs about the founder of Chinese Daoism were circulating, and Si Ma Chen himself was unsure of their authenticity. The biography, in fact, contains an account of not one, but 3, men called Lao Zi. The first Lao Zi was a man named Li Er or Lao Dan who came from the village of Churen in the southern Chinese state of Chu. Li Er served as historian in charge of the official archives in the Chinese imperial capital of Luoyang. He was a contemporary of Confucius and is reported to have granted an interview to the Confucian master when he came to Luoyang seeking information on the Zhou ritual. Another man identified as the founder of Daoism was Lao Lai Zi, who also came from Chu. He is designated as a contemporary of Confucius and is credited with a 15-chapter book expounding on the teachings of the Daoist school. Nothing more is known about him. According to a third account, the original Lao Zi lived 129 years after the death of Confucius. This man went by the name of Tan, the historian of Zhou. Scroll volumes. Every imaginable variety of text is available in the modern 60-volume reprint of the canon. 12 subdivisions arrange the material as follows: primal revelations, talismans, scriptural interpretation, or exegesis, sacred diagrams, historical texts, ethical texts, ritual texts, practical techniques, biographical information, sacred songs, and memorials. Most of the various sects and schools of Daoism focus on one or a select few of the many possibilities the canon offers. As we shall see later, recitation or chanting of sacred texts forms an important part of some ritual observances.
Are doctrine and dogma important to Daoism or CCT?
Most of the various schools and sects of Daoism can point to at least one source or compendium of their central teachings. In that sense, there is such a thing as Daoist doctrine. A body of doctrine does, in effect, define the boundaries of some of the schools, especially the more esoteric ones, and sets them apart from one another. But even in those instances, the doctrinal core is largely subordinate to a given school's central rituals and practices. CCT, on the other hand, does not define itself according to any clearly articulated doctrinal system. Children learn from their parents and extended family of elders a host of convictions and practices of the sort often called folk beliefs. Where there is no formally defined doctrine, there can be no dogma in the sense of a minimum required for membership. Of those deist schools and sects that have developed distinctive doctrinal tenets, only the most esoteric have even approached the kind of official dogmatic pronouncement one finds. For example, in Roman Catholicism.
What signs or symbols distinguish deist ritual specialists?
Deist priests or masters make extensive use of symbolic vestments in ritual settings, apparently in imitation of the garments emperors once wore for religious rituals. Deist specialists today wear three types of vestments in various colors, depending on sectarian affiliation. For the most sacred occasions, a high priest wears a square red silk poncho-like vestment called the garment of descent that symbolizes earth. For regular major rituals, the celebrants might wear a red or yellow silk overgarment called the Deo gown with the character for Taiji or the 8 trigrams on front and back. Other common decorative motifs include images of the 8 immortals, often depicted on the hems of broad, flowing sleeves. Abstract cloud designs often stand for yin, while cranes and male versions of the mythical creature called the Qilin, sometimes associated with the unicorn, but very different from the European unicorn, represent yang. For penitential rites, the assistants might wear the sea blue vestment whose darker color accords with a darker ritual purpose. Under these garments, specialists wear a square silk apron. Officiants also wear distinctive headgear, including a black skullcap under a metal 5-pointed crown, recalling the 5 elements, bestowed in the ordination ceremony. Ritual shoes like those once worn in the imperial court bear cloud symbolism that suggests the ability to walk the very heavens as the priest delivers the prayers of the people to the deities.
Do deists and practitioners of CCT believe in heaven and hell?
Since long before the beginnings of religious Daoism, the notion of heaven, Tian, as an impersonal transcendent reality has been very important to the Chinese. Some deists have identified heaven as the first materialization, or a kind of emanation, of the Dao's spiritual power. In this sense, heaven becomes an intermediary between the unmanifest Dao and all of creation. For heaven is the source of all good things. Along with earth and humanity, heaven is one of the 3 powers that bring about life as we know it. However, deists do not generally talk of heaven as the eternal abode of those who lived virtuously on earth. One region beyond ordinary earthly experience is the Isles of the Blessed, Pen Lai Shan. In the far reaches of the Eastern Sea, where the 8 immortals dwell amid an idyllic landscape. Many Chinese express the hope of finally reaching the Isles and attain immortality there. Belief in retribution after death for a less than praiseworthy life has given rise to a wealth of imagery. But Daoism and CCT call hell a multi-storied earthly prison. There are 10 levels of hell. Some prefer to talk of 10 separate hells, each with its ruling deity. They function rather like the circles of hell in Dante's Inferno, each designated for those who commit specific sins and crimes. Presiding over the first level is a sort of chief judge, who wields authority over the other 9 judge kings. Some souls never make it to their assigned hell, a difficult passageway to the hope of better things beyond that. They spend eternity wandering aimlessly and forever hungry, dependent on the kindness of the living to attend to their needs. Some sources talk of hell much as many Christians describe purgatory as temporary suffering with long-range benefits.
Do Buddhist communities run private religious schools?
In some parts of the world, traditional Buddhist religious education remains important. In Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka, for example, devout Buddhists still send their children for instruction in the local monastery. Nearly half of Thailand's primary schools are those of the local Wats or temples. And some monks travel to other schools to teach. Adults may also attend classes, lectures, and educational sermons. Monks naturally get their core religious training within the monastery's own educational structure. But skill in means requires that an effective person know how to put that learning into action. Some Thai universities have developed special curricula designed to aid the monks in their wider ministry. They can take courses in a range of socially oriented subjects and skills, including public health and hygiene, food preparation, construction of roads and bridges, temple and village organizing, agricultural development, and conflict resolution.
What would a visitor see if he went to a Daoist or CCT temple?
Larger traditional Chinese temples, of whatever affiliation, are generally laid out according to the ground plan of ancient imperial residences. Like the palace, the temple enclosure and its main interior structures generally face south. Approaching the temple, the visitor first sees a monumental gateway that offers entry through the temple's surrounding outer wall. Gracefully curved roofs decorated with numerous small multicolored glass or ceramic figures crown the gate as well as the main interior buildings. In some of the more elaborate temples, the main gateway opens into a covered forecourt, or a vestibule in which the worshipper can begin to experience the change of mind and calming of the spirit necessary for efficacious devotion. Around the perimeter of the main courtyard one might find small separate halls that function like chapels for devotion to subordinate sacred figures, as well as special features like bell towers. But the focal point of the temple, whether deist or CCT, is typically a freestanding structure in the middle or toward the rear of the main courtyard. A large cauldron or kettle filled with sand, into which devotees insert their offerings of incense sticks, stands 10 or 15 feet away from the main entry to the shrine. At either end of the main building's roofline, and often on the rooflines of other structures in the temple as well, the visitor probably will encounter a curious hybrid aquatic creature, dragon-headed and fish-tailed, called the Jiwen. Popular lore says the exuberant creature protects the building from destruction by fire. Pillars or columns decorated with deeply carved stone dragons, spiraling from bottom to top, often flank the entry to the main shrine. Smaller pillars, similarly decorated, sometimes protrude from the two ends of the roof peaks, columns that support the firmament. Chinese temples typically created a covered space in a portico surrounding the main courtyard and an open space in the courtyard itself. The main shrine may be a fairly large structure, but ordinary worshippers usually make their offerings standing in front of the building, while temple staff perform associated ritual actions closer to the altars within the shrine. Smaller neighborhood or family temples naturally lack the grand architectural layout. Many are tucked away unobtrusively over small business storefronts, or separate single-room structures with folding doors that open the entire width across the front.
Are statues and other visual imagery important in deist and CCT temples?
With the notable exception of major Confucian and imperial temples, Chinese ritual spaces are almost always filled with images of deities and other sacred figures. Principal deities occupy main altar spaces, but they often share the central spot with smaller images of other sacred figures arranged below the main image and toward the front of the altar. For many centuries, deists and practitioners of CCT evidently felt no need for anthropomorphic depictions of their deities. The advent of Buddhism, with its growing iconographic repertoire, seems to have been an important factor in the development of Chinese religious representational imagery. Images of deist deities, and of those that originated outside deist circles but are often identified as deist by association, run a wide gamut. Some of the deities are of divine origin. Others began as human beings, either historical or legendary, and achieved divine status either in life or after death. In addition to statues, colorful banners, low relief in stone and other media, and mural paintings depict mythological and other scenes meant to keep the worshipper in the proper frame of mind. Even temples that began as Buddhist institutions and which still display distinctively Buddhist imagery in their main shrines and altars have often become transformed into CCT temples by accretion over the centuries. Whatever the individual deity's lifehistory, anthropomorphic images abound.
Is there a deist or CCT creed?
Since religious Daoism and CCT emphasize practice over correct belief, they have not formulated the equivalent of creedal summaries such as those of Judaism, Islam, and even Buddhism. Daoism and CCT do, of course, presuppose certain basic beliefs and assumptions about how the world works. Most of those beliefs have to do with discerning and understanding how to cope with and benefit from the spiritual forces inherent in all things. All of the varieties of religious Daoism and CCT, therefore, have their core beliefs. But affirming one's assent to them pales in insignificance when compared to the importance of grasping the essential skills needed to negotiate life's daily challenges.
Is the term revelation useful in understanding Daoism or CCT?
Most Daoist sects and schools, and CCT generally, teach that religious truths are embedded in virtually all levels and facets of reality. Access to those truths is available largely through the mediation of ritual specialists and spiritual masters. Their task is not so much to disclose the mysteries as to facilitate the passage of power from the realm of gods and spirits to that of human beings. When ordinary people find themselves in the neighborhood of these spiritual powers, the truth behind them remains mysterious and cloaked in ambiguity. There are, however, accounts in which famous masters and sages claim to have received explicit revelations or missions directly from a deity. When deists speak of the language of revelation in these relatively rare instances, they suggest that they are pointing only to the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. The whole truth remains hidden from view and available only to a select few. This contrasts markedly with the general thrust of the Abrahamic traditions, for example, where revelation implies the disclosure of the full truth insofar as human beings can fathom it. Finally, an experience called divination writing deserves mention. Here, since it is occasionally described as a revelatory medium, the Shangqing school claims to be based on a series of nocturnal revelations. Founder Yang Shi reported that heavenly beings came to him in a vision and caused his hand to write the sacred texts.
What about more specific directives?
One of the earliest scriptures in the Pali Canon is the Vinyapitaka, the basket of discipline. Buddhist law generally emphasizes the thou shalt nots over the thou shalts. On the negative side, the vignette lists several hundred actions considered offensive and unacceptable behavior for monks and nuns. Of those, some 250 apply to monks and 348 to nuns. Topping the list for all monks and nuns is a group of 10 precepts that forbid lying, intoxicating substances, adultery, theft, killing, eating after noon, elegant beds, cosmetics, frivolous entertainment, and possession of luxuries. The first 5 also apply to lay persons, who might also choose to observe the next 3 on the 4 special monthly duty days or Sabbaths. Monks and nuns are automatically expelled from the monastic community for killing a human being or an animal. Grand larceny, or sexual misconduct. Other important categories in monastic law include offenses that require a community consultation, those that call for restitution of some kind, return of goods improperly received, and issues of due process in resolving problems. Apart from these specific regulations, Buddhist teaching offers a number of more general guidelines for lay people. It recommends, for example, seeking adequate income, acquiring a professional skill, frugality, freedom from debt, and giving generously to good causes.
What is a Buddhist nun?
The Buddha himself decided, not without hesitation, to institute a female counterpart to male membership in the monastic Sangha. Nuns, called Bhikshunis, or female mendicants, had from the start to defer to monks, and were required to abide by over 100 additional disciplinary regulations. Many scholars note that the formal lineage of the order of Buddhist nuns has long since been disrupted. Still, groups of women throughout Asia live in community and consider themselves members of the Sangha. Most shave their heads, wear monastic garb, and live according to traditional norms and engage in practices such as scriptural recitation. Representatives of several Chinese lineages are perhaps the most numerous. Like their male counterparts, nuns also undergo a period of training as novices, before they can be considered for higher ordination to full monastic membership. Once presented by her sponsor, the candidate submits to an in-depth questioning as to her suitability. If she passes, a senior nun proposes acceptance. Then the candidate is questioned again by a panel of monks. Passing that, the candidate is sent back to her sisters for further training and acceptance into the higher initiation.
Are Daoist and CCT sacred spaces marked with any distinctive signs and symbols?
It is not always possible to determine from a Chinese sacred spaces exterior design and decor to which of the religious traditions it belongs. Mosques, including those in Chinese settings, have their distinctive minarets, churches have their spires and crosses. and Hindu temples have their monumental facades and towers marking inner shrines. Some Chinese Buddhist temples announce their identity with pagodas or stupas. But that is not always the case. Chinese temple rooflines often display colorful small figures that appear to be engaged in vigorous action. But even these are not a reliable indicator of the holy place's specific religious affiliation. The animated figures on the rooflines are sometimes scenes taken from Chinese opera or classical novels, chosen here because they allude to certain important moral virtues. Inside the temple, more specific clues are available. But even there one has to look carefully to distinguish the sacred symbols of Daoism from those of CCT. For example, a statue of the Bodhisattva Guanyin, originally Buddhist, may appear on a small altar under the covered area toward the front of the inner courtyard. But that does not mean that this is a Buddhist temple. It does, however, indicate that this is not a Daoist temple and probably belongs to CCT, which has borrowed Guanyin from Buddhism and made her an important deity. A Daoist temple's most distinctive symbol is its main altar. Although the overall setting varies from one sect to another, there are several important common features. Before the central deity on the altar stands a perpetually lit lamp symbolizing wisdom and the light of the Dao. Two candles symbolizing sun and moon flank the lamp a few inches further toward the front of the altar. Cups of water, yang, tea, yin, and uncooked rice, yang and yin united, stand before the candles. Further toward the front of the altar stand 5 plates of fruit, each of a different color, symbolizing the 5 elements in perfect proportion. Centered near the front stands an incense burner, a reminder of the heat that purifies the 3 vital energies symbolized by 3 sticks of incense. Some temporary sacred spaces are constructed of bamboo for specific seasonal Daoist rituals.
Apart from the trigrams and taiji, what are some common traditional symbols?
Ancient lore associates fundamental features of Chinese cosmology with specific symbols. It all goes back to the Chinese atom, Pangu. In his task of imposing order on primal chaos, Pangu enlisted the help of 5 cosmic assistants: Azure Dragon, White Tiger, Phoenix, Tortoise, and Unicorn. Pangu assigned to each of the first 4 a quarter of the universe. Azure Dragon governed the east, associated with spring, new life, benevolence, and protection. White Tiger ruled the autumnal west, symbol of maturity and a life well spent. All made possible by good government and courage. Phoenix, the ultimate solar bird, presided over the summery south with the kindly warmth and joy that arises in a world at peace. Hard-shelled and indomitable, the ageless tortoise faced the unforgiving, wintry north. Wandering freely among them all, the rare and delicate unicorn was commissioned to appear wherever and whenever benevolence and justice reigned on earth. It is not surprising that all 5 of these wondrous beings retain their appeal to the popular imagination and remain essentials of the religious symbolic repertoire. A cluster of items associated loosely with Daoism are called the 8 Daoist emblems. Each represents one of the 8 immortals, a group of human beings who became immortal in various ways. They appear often as decorative motifs on all kinds of objects. The emblems are a fan, a sword, a gourd, castanets, a flower basket, a bamboo drum, a flute, and a lotus flower. This is one of several sets of 8 motifs popular in Chinese art and, along with the 8 Buddhist emblems, one that still carries specifically religious resonances.
What is the Daoism?
Daoist stories of how the world came to be are full of mythic features similar to those of other cosmogonies. They tell how order overcame chaos, how the heavens and earth came to be separated, and how the innumerable deities 36,000 according to one reckoning fit into the grand picture. What is unique and most interesting about Daoist myth is that the gods do not necessarily take an active role in cosmic affairs. They do not intervene in the unfolding cosmos, nor even nudge the process along, for that matter. Instead, they allow the fundamental laws of creation itself to operate unimpeded. Indeed, the gods themselves come into being as part of this whole unfolding set in motion by an impersonal power called heaven.